seemed insurmountable. They were hard to penetrate. But the Lord had promised to go before them, and they were to march forward no matter how great that battle seemed to be, or how insurmountable those walls seemed to be to get through. And we'll start in Joshua 5 and 13. And it says, "And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn, in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, Art thou for us, or for our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. We see here Joshua standing somewhere near Jericho, perhaps looking at these great walls, and I imagine him looking at them and seeking the Lord as to how we're to get through those. Did you have something? Mm-hmm. We're gonna get there. Yeah, we're gonna get there. Anyway, he's looking at these great walls, and like I said, I picture him, seeking the Lord as to, how we're supposed to do this. And, the context seems to fit that, because you have this captain that comes to him and gives him instruction on, how this battle is to take place and what they're to do. In verse 13, we see Joshua, he lifts up his eyes, and behold, there stood a man with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua, seeing this man, asked him if he was friend or foe. And the stranger didn't identify himself as either. He was not an ally, but rather he was on God's side. He was the commander. The stranger says, Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. He was the commander of this army. And what was Joshua's response to this man? Falls on his face to the earth, and he did worship. Many commentators draw a parallel between Joshua's encounter here and in Moses, with Moses in the burning bush, with his encounter with God in Exodus 3. Due to the similar language between Joshua 5:15 and Exodus 3:5. Many argue different points as to who this really was, whether it was just a theophany, which is basically a manifestation of God that we can actually visualize, or a pre-incarnate Christ. But either way, the point here that we need to take is that this prostration, this obeisance, was him showing submission to the presence of God. And it's not hard to see here that God has come to Joshua and revealed himself on the eve of an important battle. This commander was obviously on God's side, leading the quest to fulfill God's purpose. The question was not really whether this guy was on their side or the allies' side, but this guy says he's the captain of the host. The question really is whether Israel was on God's side. And his message to Joshua is an important principle for all of us who desire God's help in battle. The question is the same for us. It's not whether God is on the side of his children. He's on the side of his children. Everything he does is for our good. The power of God is available to his people as they obey him and align themselves with his will. So the question is not whether God is on the side of his children, but whether his children are really on the side of God and willing to do what he has for us to do and tells us to do. That this is an absolute condition of victory, his obedience to his word and what he would have us do. It's absolute it's a condition for Joshua, for Israel, and for us. And for us, that's being full surrender to Christ in our lives, letting him be Lord in our lives. We see Joshua recognize God's presence, and then we see his response to God's presence. In verse 15, the captain of the Lord's host tells Joshua to take off his shoe, for the place where he stands is holy. And Joshua did so. And as we said, this event bears close resemblance to Moses' encounter with God in Exodus. And this parallel is important. Moses was chosen to lead God's people out of captivity, out of bondage in Egypt. And Joshua was to continue that mission in leading them into the promised land. And the presence of God would make the difference between failure and success. Israel would only find conquest over their enemies through God's help and power. And that help only comes when we're obedient to his word and doing his will. These verses should tell us that we as well need the presence of the Lord within us, with us, in order to win the battles that we face. Within the recognition of that truth must be a sense of surrender to God's majesty and holiness. He calls us to submit to him, regardless of what abilities, possessions, or leadership skills we may have. Nothing compares to God's presence. Nothing. No matter what we do, what great victories we may seem to win in the flesh, nothing compares to God's presence in battle. As Joshua faced this seemingly impossible task before him, he needed to stay focused on God as his source. And we too must respond to God by exalting him and entrusting our paths to his care and guidance. The only proper response in the presence of God is humility and unquestioning obedience. The divine instructions follow in Joshua 6, and obedience is still key. We turn to Joshua 6 and 1. And it says, Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, and none came in. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor, and ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow with the trumpets, and it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horns, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up every man straight before him. God, through this captain of the host of the Lord, gives Joshua a step-by-step plan for the conquest of Jericho. Joshua is not to be the proud conqueror with his own ingenious battle plan. It was God's plan. He couldn't say, look what I done, look what I thought of, look at this, mighty warrior I am, because it was all that glory was to go to the Lord, because what was done there could be explained no other way than God done it. And that's the way God likes it. He's not going to glory in our flesh. Joshua, he was to listen intently to the voice of God. Then he was to apply precisely the divine instructions. He was to relay those to the Israelites, to the whole company. Not one element was left to chance or for choice. He could not pick and choose what steps he wanted to take. And as we saw in lesson 2, the population of Jericho knew of the Israelites. Their fame went before them. They knew of the mighty acts God had done on Israel's behalf. We see that in Joshua 6:1. Jericho's residents were fearful of the Israelites as they locked up the city and allowed no one to enter or to exit. They had locked up the city so tightly that it was virtually impenetrable. They did not have to convince the residents of Jericho that God was with them. They knew. If the presence of God is there, there is no question. They knew that God was with the Israelites. And I looked up, I was trying to see, how far they had to, march around that city and stuff. And they said it was like the inner part of it was like 9 acres. So they had an inner wall, and then there was an outer wall. So there's like 2 walls that had to come down. And I still don't know how far around that would be to walk every day, but it was 9 acres in a circle. I'm just going to say. Anyway, if the presence of God is there, there is no question. People will know, the enemy will know, and they will take notice, just as they did in Jericho. Jericho was straightly or securely locked up because of the children of Israel. Israel could not have taken the city by known military means, such as climbing the walls or tunneling under them or trying to burst through the gates. They had them big old ramming things that sometimes they would run with and break down gates and stuff. God's plan was just to bring the whole wall down at once. God had already accorded the victory of Jericho to Joshua and to the children of Israel. And I go back to Joshua standing on this hill looking over Jericho before he was given these instructions, doing what we would do, scratching our heads, Lord, how are we going to do this? And just like, we do when we're seeking the Lord, we're praying, but we're fighting the battle in our mind. I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to do it that way. I'm sure he plays these battles out in his mind, and all those known ways of getting through those walls and those gates come to his mind. Because, that's what happens with us. All the known ways of doing things come to our mind, the flesh ways, those ways that feel good to us, come to his mind, saying, if I do this, this will happen. If they say that, I'm going to say this. I ain't the only one. Maybe I am. Yeah. We're going to get to that. But anyway, these walls offered a real obstacle to Israel in the conquest of the land. And it has a similar function with us, but, just a different structure and origin. We have to look at it spiritually speaking. To the world, which we as believers must conquer, if a life of victory that glorifies God is to be ours, while we may fight these battles in our minds, those things, it doesn't do any good. We're just causing gray hairs and heartburn. If we could just learn to give it to the Lord and just seek Him as to what He would have us do in those situations, how to get through those walls, then we would save ourselves a lot of heartburn. The only way that we are to act in anything is by the instruction of the Lord. Do what He tells us to do about the situation, and not do those things that come in our mind and, if they say this, we say that. They were to just act in total, undeviating obedience to His instructions, and that's what we should do. The city was to be taken in faith and obedience to God's word, and not by human wisdom or wise calculation. If we have faith, we'll be obedient. They go hand in hand. Without obedience, we don't have faith. We can say all day long we've got faith, but if we're not obedient to this word, we don't have it. So, yes, ma'am. They're all still flat, huh? Wow. Did y'all hear Peggy? On it, it's just all still there. I looked that up, trying to see, and, different scientists and archaeologists, have tried to, they try to, explain it away. It wasn't really there, it was over here. A great earthquake happened, but I've never seen an earthquake just make them go down flat. If you watch where these cities have fallen down from earthquakes, you wouldn't just be able to walk straight across it like God told them to do. I mean, there's just little holes you can navigate through here and there, but that's the way of the world, to just explain it all away. So for once, each day for 6 days, they were to march silently around the city. Men of war that were armed would march first. Now, our book, the big book, they completely got all this wrong. I don't know how they did it. I guess they just didn't read the scripture, but they have the order of this completely wrong. If you go back and you actually read verses 6 through 14, it gives you the order. But anyway, that's why it's good when you're reading stuff to make sure you have the Bible there to confirm it. It's a good thing to do. But anyway, the armed men would march first, followed by 7 priests that would have these trumpets of ram's horns. Then the Ark of the Covenant would come, and those that would be carrying the Ark of the Covenant would be Levites from the Kohath division. And that would be in obedience to God's word, because they were given charge of the Ark in Numbers 3:29 through 31. So we would have to say that if they were being obedient, that the Levites of the division of Kohath was carrying the Ark. They would have been careful in their handling of the presence of the Lord, which is what the Ark was. It was a visible sign of the presence of the Lord. And then behind the Ark would come a rear guard of armed men. And we see that in verse 9. So that the Ark was well protected before and behind. So the presence of the Lord was in the midst of the people. So you had armed men, the ram's horn priest, the Ark, and then more armed men. And then verses 6 through 14, we're not going to have time to read those, report this exact carrying out of those instructions. So you can go back and read that if you want to. You should read it. There weren't any women there. That's probably why they were able to be quiet, right? Oh, you're a mess. So day by ominous day, they're marching around this city silently, with the only sounds being the feet and these trumpet blasts that they would make as they walked. And as you picture that happening, we can imagine the impact of what was going on inside Jericho and what was going on, in the minds of the people who are doing the marching. Inside the walls, the inhabitants of Jericho probably were a little bit on edge. They had heard of the fame of the Israelites, and And then they probably come a little bit amused by their tactics, because this wasn't, your everyday way of, conquering a city, just marching silently around the city. And then, that could have kind of relaxed their mood, that, nothing's really bad going to happen. And then looking at the actions that the Israelites were doing, as they're doing what they're doing, this could have easily demoralized any of those whose faith was not in God, because this would have seemed, like they were expending useless energy and nothing being done. It wasn't lending much to the cause that they were supposed to be doing, and that would be conquering Jericho. It was an incredible step of faith on the part of the Israelites to march around the city every day for a week. Their actions were to be punctuated on the seventh day, when after circling the city that day 7 times, the priests were to blow a long trumpet blast. They had just been given a little intermittent trumpet blast, but on this day there would be a long trumpet blast. And the whole army at that time was to shout. And the Lord would bring the wall down in a way that allowed only Him to receive the glory. For Israel, again, mere obedience was the key to taking Jericho. We come to walls in our lives, and the only way those walls come down is through obedience. Pride can be a wall in conquering, those enemies in our life. When we get saved, we come out of that promise. We come out of Egypt. I'll get it right in a minute. We come out, but we still have to go forth and have enemies to fight in our lives, and those enemies are ourselves. Pride. We can name a whole 10 pages full of things in our lives that are not pleasing to the Lord. And the Lord will bring people in our lives that will bring out those characteristics in us that aren't pleasing. Please. Now you got to let me obey me, and I'll show you how to react and how to get that out of there and not to react with that pride in you. In verses 15 and 16, Joshua gives the orders to shout. And it says, "And it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day, and compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priests blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, Shout, for the Lord hath given you the city." Then we see Joshua relaying to the people the precise instructions from the Lord regarding the fate of the city once the walls collapsed. And I figured this had really already been given to them, but we see instruction, we see them carrying it out. We see instruction, then we see them carrying it out. I don't know for sure, but it seems kind of hard that, as he's saying shout and they're taking off running, that he's giving them these instructions. But hey, it's the Lord. He does things ways we don't do. "And the city shall be accursed," it says, verse 17, "even it and all that are therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest you make yourselves accursed, when you take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse, and trouble it. But all the silver and the gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord." So they were to get rid of everything, except for Rahab, everybody, babies, cattle, sheep, everything, except for Rahab, because of what she had done, and we'll get into that, and the metals. They couldn't burn the metals away, so those would just be used for the work of the Lord in the temple. The city was accursed. It was devoted to destruction for the achievement of a divine purpose, and that meant total destruction of all people and objects, again, except for Rahab the harlot and her household. And then precious metals would be used in the tabernacle. The people were warned to keep themselves from the accursed things, meaning they should not keep any of those things deemed for destruction for personal use. The emphasis on accursed things should not be taken lightly, and we can look at that in our lives today. If one Israelite kept for himself one of those objects, one of those sheep, as you see next week they do, even though they were obedient and did what they were supposed to do for the walls to come down, once they got there they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And that is a very good picture of how, our sanctification goes. We get saved and then we go on and don't do what we're supposed to do. We don't let the Lord do the work in our lives. Anyway, can't get into next week. If any of them took any of those objects, they were placing all of Israel under a curse. And not only do our actions affect us, but they affect others. They affect those we go to church with. They affect the work of Christ. They affect how people view Christ. And we are representatives of this church, and most importantly, of who Christ is. And just like the Israelites, and y'all see next week, that when they did those things they weren't supposed to do, it didn't just affect that person who took it, it affected the whole congregation. There must be obliteration of every element, living and non-living, of this pagan city as an example to other Canaanites of what was to follow. In doing God's work, we must follow His plan and consecrate our lives to His purpose. We must follow the leading of the Holy Spirit and allow sanctification to take place in our lives. Canaan was a picture of sin. All those ites were a picture of sin. And we have all those ites in our life, like pride and rebellious spirit, whatever it may be. God promised victory, but even with that victory, they had to obey and keep from those accursed things. And that means denial of things that would pull us aside from Him, pull us aside from God. Too many valuable servants of God allow themselves to be sidetracked by the pull of material success or the allurement of sexual attraction. Ministers, as well, not discerning that their calling from God is the highest vocation imaginable in this world. They're responsible for keeping the sheep. And it's not to be lightly taken or set aside for lesser goods or temptations. Verse 20 says, "So the people shouted when the priest blew with the trumpets. And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him. And they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword." The immense wall that surrounded Jericho, again, fell down flat. Such a wall would certainly, like we were saying earlier, leave a pile of rubble that would make things hard to negotiate through to get into the city. Yet by the hand of God it collapsed in such a way that Israel was able to enter the city, every man straight before him. As where they were standing, as they were marching, they went in. The trumpet blast did not bring the wall down, and neither did their shouting. God brought the wall down. He brought it down in response to their obedience. They followed His command, and He acted on their behalf. God works in a similar way in our lives. He gives us commands, and we are called to respond. Our obedience, as an act of faith, will be rewarded with mighty blessings from God. This was a blessing. Them being victorious over this city was a blessing. Verse 22 says, "But Joshua had said unto the two men that had spied out the country, Go into the harlot's house, and bring out thence the woman, and all that she hath, as ye swear unto her. And the young men that were spies went in, and brought out Rahab, and her father, and her mother, and her brethren, and all that she had. And they brought out all her kindred, and left them without the camp of Israel. And they burnt the city with fire and all that was therein. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua saved Rahab the harlot alive, and her father's household, and all that she had, and she dwelleth in Israel even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Rahab had done what the spies had told her to do. When they had went to spy the city, I don't know if y'all covered this last week or not. Anyway, when they went to spy out the city, Rahab helped them. And they had told her to display a scarlet cord out of her window located on the city wall, and they would, save her household, anybody that was in that house. And this is kind of a picture of the Passover, when the Lord passed over the ones that had the blood on the door. And they say that all those walls fell except for that little place right there where her house was, on the side of that wall. And anybody who she wanted, was willing to be saved, was to be in that house, and they weren't to go out of that door. If they did, their blood was on their own hand. They were going to get killed like everybody else. Anyway, she had recognized the divine sovereignty of God, of the God of Israel. And as a result, she and her family had come under God's covenant with Israel. And they were still dwelling with Israel when the book of Joshua was written. We see in verse 25. And most notably, Rahab would become one of 4 women to be included in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And verse 26 says, And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city, Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was noised throughout all the country. Joshua didn't voice this curse for no reason. It was instead prophetic of the time of Ahab, king of northern Israel. If you look in 1 Kings 16:34, you see this guy Hiel, H-E-I-L, of the city of Bethel, starts reconstructing the walls of Jericho. He laid the foundations for the walls and set up the gates. Just like Joshua said, he'll lay the foundation at the cost of his firstborn son. He'll put up the gates at the cost of his youngest son. And so he was prophetically cursing the one who would eventually do that. These events demonstrated Joshua to be a man with whom God dwelt, and established him as Moses' successor. And in closing, Romans 8:31 teaches us that if God is for us, we need not fear or despair over who or what might come against us. This is the message found in this lesson. That God is to receive glory for all that goes on in our lives. We don't ever overcome being prideful of our own accord. It's the work of the Lord. The Lord provides the means by which we can experience victory over the trials of life. However, we must respond to Him in obedience. With His help must come the realization that He receives the glory. We must not seek our own ways or claim credit. We also must be willing to trust Him, surrender our circumstances to His care. And just consider the trials that you may be facing. And take time through prayer and Bible study to seek God for guidance and direction. Israel's first victory in Canaan came because Joshua listened intently to God and obeyed. We as the people of God must realize that we fight a spiritual battle. We fight that battle on our knees in prayer, and only act on that which God would have us act on. We must not allow ourselves to become sidetracked from our mission. Neither must we adopt the ways of the world as we battle against the enemy of our souls. That's all I have.